Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. It's very weird being in here with all of this because this is usually our mess hall. I should start off by saying who I am. I'm Jeff Chetirko. I'm the principal of the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School located here on fabulous Governor's Island. I just want to welcome you all today to our space and also just give you a little bit of information about our school, and then I'll hand it off and you can enjoy the rest of your day. Wish the weather was a little better, but I think the rain is holding off. So we are a New York City public school located out here on Governor's Island. We are, the building that you're in right now is one of two buildings. There's another building on the other side of the island. And we are strictly an unscreened public school. We don't screen our students. We are part of the New York City diversity plan where 70% of our incoming students, seats for our students are for students that are economically disadvantaged, because the mission of the school is to provide opportunities into the maritime field where opportunities usually don't exist within New York City. So we have 7 different career and technical education programs. In this building here, behind me, we have the Marine Biology Research Program, Ocean Engineering, Marine Policy and Advocacy, and Marine System Technology Welding. On the other side of the island, where we have waterfront access, we have vessel operations, where students are driving boats in the harbor. We have professional scuba diving. We have aquaculture, where our students are growing oysters, and Marine System Technology, woodworking and wood shop, engine repair. So those are pretty extensive in terms of our career and technical education offerings to our students. And all of it is really to give opportunity for our students to continue the pathway into the maritime field or into the college of their choice that many times is SUNY Maritime, SUNY Cobleskill, or SUNY Morrisville, Maine, Rhode Island. Even many of our students go out to Hawaii to continue their professional scuba diving track. And so we are 500 students strong. It's an amazing experience. A lot of you already asked me, so you're telling me 500 students take the ferry every day to come here? Yes, they do, which is amazing. It's a beautiful morning, just being able to get away from your neighborhood, get away from, all your troubles, get on that ferry, and then come here to gorgeous Governor's Island. And then going home is a little bit trickier because then you have 500 students after a very long day, as you can imagine, heading back off the island. So, but it's always fun. It's always a good time. And lastly, I'll just speak to the future of Urban Assembly New York Harbor School at a time when we're seeing New York City public school system losing enrollment overall. We have been fortunate, thanks to Governor's Island support, to be increasing the number of our students and also our space. We are going from 500 students to 1,000 students very soon. We are going from 2 buildings to 4 buildings. So the buildings over here to your right, the building right here to your right, is going to be converted into 12 additional classrooms for our school and a very big library, which we're very excited about. And then behind me, where the dog park is, I'm looking at Clare, right? Where the dog park is, we may have to move that, is going to be another building that's going to have an Olympic-sized pool, a full-size gymnasium, and 4 science labs dedicated to aquaculture. We do all this work with Billion Oyster Project, which the mission is to put 1 billion oysters into the New York Harbor, because every oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day, 50 gallons of water a day, and it's much needed because, as you know, all the sewage from Brooklyn and Manhattan, if it rains more than 1/4 of an inch, goes into the harbor, and we need something to filter that water out. All of our career technical education programs work in conjunction with Billion Oyster Project, work with Governor's Island, and we're super happy to report that as of today, we have 100 million oysters in the New York Harbor. So we have a ways to go, but in the meantime, hopefully next year, if we have this event here again, we will say 300 million. So thank you all so much for being here today. This means a lot for our community that you chose us and chose our amazing island to be part and celebrate here. So thank you all. I appreciate it.
Jeff's quite tall, as it turns out. Good morning, everyone. I'm Clare Newman. I'm the president and CEO of the Trust for Governor's Island. Thank you, Jeff, for opening the day, and thank you for being such a fantastic partner on Governor's Island. We and our partnership with the Harbor School, we think, is such a fantastic example of the type of activities we can see growing here on Governor's Island, which is really centered around education, and especially education about the environment. And so I want to particularly highlight that those science labs that will be behind us will also be a fantastic opportunity to create pathways into higher education and into careers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But thank you, Jonathan, and the Institute for Public Architecture for organizing such a fantastic full day of convening here and for bringing together this amazing group of stakeholders and audience. And I want to especially thank the Borough President, Reynoso, for being here, Brooklyn Borough President, Council Member Restler here from Brooklyn as well, and then Dan Wiley from Nydia Velasquez's office. Welcome, Dan. So is this anyone's first trip to Governor's Island? Oh, good. See, nice. We think that Governor's Island really is one of New York City's hidden gems, and every time I do a talk like this, I'm amazed by how many hands go up, and so we're so excited to bring more people out to the island that will hopefully fall in love. Governor's Island has a very rich history. We were originally used by the Lenape as a hunting and fishing camp, and then from the early 1800s to the mid-1900s, it was an army base and a strategic part of the early US's fortification system for New York Harbor. From 1966 to 1996, it was a Coast Guard hub, and for those of you who have explored the island tomorrow, it is amazing to think back to those days when the whole outside of the island was covered with barracks buildings. Some were 14 stories tall. There were 3,000 people who lived on the island, and it functioned like a sixth borough of the city. Everything you needed to live, so schools, hospital, a dry cleaner, a bowling alley. Obviously, everybody needs a Burger King, and there was one of those out here. But really, thanks to a broad-based advocacy campaign led here in New York City after the Coast Guard left in 1996, Governor's Island came back to the hands of local government in 2003. And I was just talking with the borough president, and honestly not dissimilar to the type of action you're seeing now around the BQE, which is bringing together an extraordinary range of stakeholders advocating for something. And eventually that led to the transfer. So in 2003, the island was sold back to the city for $1. And for the past 20 years, we at the Trust have been on a mission to basically turn Governor's Island back into a resource for New Yorkers. And I grew up in New York City, and I had never heard of, let alone been to Governor's Island. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a kid like that in New York today. So we pursue that mission really through three key pathways. The first is delivering a fantastic park, open space, and nature experience to New York City. And I think all of us have had the experience of coming out to the island and just riding a bike and feeling like you've gotten away, all from an 8-minute ferry ride from Manhattan or Brooklyn. And that's something we continue to focus on and expand and make sure we're delivering an affordable experience to New Yorkers from every single zip code in the city. Second, we've been working hard in the past couple of years on this vertical of education around the field of environment. And so the Harbor School is our first leading example of that, but we were very proud 2 weeks ago to announce that Stony Brook University, a SUNY institution, will be leading a consortium of higher education universities to build here a climate research-focused campus in the heart of New York Harbor. And then third, and really I think one of the key things that led originally to the popularity of Governor's Island was our focus on arts and culture. And many leaders before me recognized that Governor's Island is the ideal place to present public art and to bring together a diverse group of cultural practitioners to talk about issues like this, to tackle the thorniest challenges that we face as a city, as a country, as a globe, whether that be urban transit or whether it be the climate crisis. and to have a place where we can engage that deep practice and take a day away. And so Jonathan and the Institute for Public Architecture were really the first organization to answer our call, looking for year-round tenants to come and make Governor's Island their home and a platform for this type of work. So we are so excited to see today happen, to see the kind of conversations we're gonna enjoy today, and to see the collaboration between Jonathan and the IPA and all the other cultural and educational practitioners on the island. And hopefully that's something that is just gonna grow and grow in the future. So thank you all, and thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to hear the conversation. And I'll turn it over to Jonathan to introduce the next speakers.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to BQE 2053. And thank you, Clare. Thank you, Jeffrey. Also want to thank everybody who's come out so early in the morning on a rainy Saturday to be here. We really appreciate it. Some more thanks. I'd like to thank the National Endowment for the Arts for their generous support of our symposium. Thank you again to the Trust for Governor's Island, the Urban Assembly Harbor School, our corporate sponsors, Alloy Development and AECOM, our event partners, AIA Brooklyn, Archtober, and Classic Harborline, and our media sponsors, Architectural Record, New York Review of Architecture, and Brooklyn Eagle. Additional thanks are due to the IPA board, many of whom are here today, our wonderful cadre of volunteers you'll see sprinkled around the venue, and with special thanks to Beth Broom, our volunteer media coordinator, who doesn't like to be given a shout out to, but I'd like to shout out to Beth. Thank you. And last but definitely not least, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our multi-talented residency director and social media whiz, Alec Ravensky, and our, by the way, this was a mess hall and now it's a conference center, so there you go. And as well, our tireless, fearless, and good-humored, and she has to be because she's got the hardest job in the world, our interim executive director, Janet Fink. And as a side note, I think it's fair to say that our plucky IPA really is the poster child for an organization that punches well above our weight. With everything we present, including this all-day symposium, done with only 2 part-time staff members, mixed in with a lot of love and determination. So please feel free to pull me aside today if you have any ideas about how we might nourish our bottom line with increased financial support. That, frankly, is my job as the founder of the Institute for Public Architecture. Speaking of nourishment, I hope you've all had a chance to carb up on the delicious bagels and coffee in the back, as it's going to be a jam-packed day of presentations and discussions led by an incredible and diverse roster of speakers. But given our tight schedule, I'm going to keep my part short and sweet and simply say that when I founded the IPA back in 2009, during the worst financial meltdown since the Great Depression, I didn't really know what lay ahead, nor how exactly to steer this newly formed not-for-profit. As an architect with a small firm focused on projects in the public sector, I'd had my share of challenges and adversities, but nothing really prepared me for the road ahead with the IPA. 10 years of trial and error creating a robust set of public programs centered around place-based residencies and fellowships was accompanied by both success and growing pains. Then the IPA came smack into the crush of COVID. What might have doomed our lean and mean, under-resourced but ambitious organization actually provided us the time and the space to respond to the RFP for the Governor's Island Blockhouse, which we nevertheless, and Claire, you might not know this, felt was a very long shot. Somehow, though, the stars aligned for the IPA, and we were selected by the Trust to occupy for the next 15 years, now 14, the landmark former brig, then hospital, then ferry operator residence. And after last year's renovation, the blockhouse is now the home of our full-year overnight residency and fellowship programs, along with a design library and exhibition space open to the public. On that subject, I encourage all of you who haven't had a chance to catch the BQE 2053 exhibition at the Blockhouse before it closes tomorrow evening to peruse the visionary work of our 2020 and 2022 fellows. And with that, let's get things started. Please welcome District 33 City Councilman Lincoln Restler, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Please, first, let's just give Jonathan and Janet and the entire IPA team a big round of applause. And thank you to Jeffrey and to Clare from the Harbor School and Governor's Island Trust for hosting us. It's really special to be here. I want to thank the IPA, though, for two reasons. Firstly, for bringing us together around what is the most consequential capital project that is on the table in the city of New York today. It is critically important that we create the time and space to really talk and think and plan together right now, because it is urgent, it is moving forward rapidly. And secondly, to frame the conversation the right way around 2053. Unfortunately, too many of our leaders in government are just focused on how do we fix the problem of today, patch things up, replace things, keep the same Robert Moses relics in place, and not think forward to the future that we deserve around how do we move freight, how do we actually achieve our carbon goals, and how do we finally integrate this infrastructure into our communities rather than divide it. You know, as probably 5 or 6 years ago, I was working in the de Blasio administration as a staffer at City Hall, and the Department of Transportation released a plan to put a highway directly through the promenade. And I grew up 1 block away from the promenade, and it felt like everyone I had ever met in my entire life started to call my cell phone and say, "What is happening?" And we were able to persuade the mayor that we needed to hit reset and rethink how we could fix the BQE. And we convinced him to appoint a blue ribbon panel with distinguished civic leaders like Hank Gutman, who has contributed years of his life to making for a better BQE. And ever since, it's felt like this is the project that has taken up the most of my time. Now, as the council member who represents large swath of the BQE through Brooklyn and Brooklyn Heights, through the Navy, along the Navy Yard, and into Williamsburg and Greenpoint, I spend, more time on this than just about anything else. And it's really important, because what the Adams administration has proposed is basically to expand the triple cantilever highway infrastructure from 2 to 3 lanes in each direction, representing 6 million more cars running through the neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights each and every year. And I just cannot understand it. We have not expanded highway infrastructure in New York City in my lifetime, and I'm almost as old as Antonio. It is the wrong approach, and we need to be thinking about what is the future of the BQE. And there's no one better to have centered as our keynote speaker today than Councilmember Reynoso. When he was a staffer to his predecessor, Councilmember Diana Reyna, who I saw sneaking in the back. Sorry, I didn't say that. I didn't say late. That was somebody else. But it's good to see you, Diana. You know, he began working with her and others on a proposal to rethink the BQ Green in South Williamsburg. And like Antonio, you know, he and I both grew up a block away from the BQE. Robert Moses had chosen to carve the BQE around Brooklyn Heights rather than through the middle of the south side of Williamsburg in his neighborhood. And so whereas the impacts on air quality and noise were much different in Brooklyn Heights than they were in the south side of Williamsburg, a predominantly Latino community, a low-income community, and the environmental injustice that this highway, the racism that this highway has represented for so many years, I think is really, couldn't be better represented than the difference in our respective experiences as children growing up alongside it. Right now is a moment where we need to be thinking about the future of the BQE corridor as a whole, not just focusing on the triple cantilever, but thinking about how does this highway interact with all of our neighborhoods? How do we actually invest in a future that makes our neighborhoods healthier, that moves freight sustainably? And we are very fortunate to have a borough president who is committed to bringing together stakeholders from across the borough, thinking about the transformative future that we deserve, thinking about the environmental justice that our communities demand. And so without further ado, I want to introduce my friend, Brooklyn's Borough President, Antonio Reynoso.
Thank you so much to Lincoln Restler, a good friend of mine. I think we've known each other since I've been 22 years old. I am slightly older than him, but I have less grays in the hair. My name is Antonio Reynoso, and I'm the president of the greatest borough in the city of New York, which is Brooklyn, first and foremost. I know we're not in Brooklyn, but Clare just let me know. She just let me know that there were more visitors to Governor's Island from Brooklyn than Manhattan. So we're going to start having a conversation about where Governor's Island should land in which boroughs. But I do want to thank Clare for everything. Jeffrey, thank you so much for opening up. And more Harbor School students from Brooklyn. We're practically in Brooklyn. It's okay. I want to thank them for allowing us to be here. To IPA, it's very important that the conversation around the BQE not only be centered around the triple cantilever, and then that's all the conversations we've had. To see this, the graphic, to see 2053, is that there are folks out there that are truly dedicated and working on having a more holistic approach and comprehensive approach to infrastructure like this. The one thing that this city does poorly is plan. I call it a Department of City Zoning, not the Department of City Planning. And we need to start talking about planning in a real way, because that's how we're going to solve for real problems. And IPA ensuring that this is about the entire corridor versus just one section is helping push that conversation along. And now I have a great staff that writes great talking points for me, and they wrote a speech, and about 10% of the time I read it. But I'm going to read it today because they work very hard, and I want to thank them as well. But again, I am Antonio Reynoso, so happy to be here. But way before I got to Borough Hall, I was just a kid from the south side of Williamsburg. I grew up hearing the big trucks hauling themselves through our streets. I grew up waiting for the last car to run their red light as they turned into Marcy or Rodney before I started across the crosswalk. I grew up thinking my community in two parts, my side and the other side. So when we talk about the BQE, we're not really talking about Robert Moses or America's obsession with car culture or architectural feats like the cantilever. We're talking about people like me, the kids and families and residents of Brooklyn who have suffered the consequences of the BQE for generations and who continue to live with them. For us, the BQE is bisected neighborhoods, high childhood asthma rates, and heavy traffic. It's the playgrounds we grow up on, the basketball courts covered in soot and clouded by toxic pollution. So when we talk about why we need to reimagine the BQE, top to bottom, not just in Brooklyn Heights, it isn't about want, it's about need. It's about environmental justice, our neighbors' health and well-being, and the safety of our streets. It's about it never being too late to do better, to do right. Because the thing is, the city knows that the area in the cantilever near Brooklyn Heights is falling apart and it needs to be redone. There's no question about it. The infrastructure has lapsed, and sooner or later, in one way or another, it's going to be revived. But the northern and southern portion also need help. And remember, the only reasons we're here is because the Brooklyn Heights community had the political capital during the Robert Moses era to ask for the BQE to run not through their neighborhood, but around it. In doing so, they get special infrastructure, the three-tiered cantilever and promenade. We didn't get that in the north and the south. We got the destruction, the division, the long-term health harms. So all we're asking the state DOT to do now is to show up the way the city is showing up for their portion and do the joint request with the city to the federal government for this grant money that's been set aside precisely for projects like this that reconnect communities and address environmental injustices of the past. But New York State has said no. They've said they don't want to show up. They've said they don't want to be a part of it. The worst part is that we're not even asking them for money. We're just asking for federal government. We're asking the federal government, and Brooklyn needs to make changes that people from Greenpoint and Bay Ridge are asking for. Just a couple of weeks ago, we attended a learning circle put on by Uprose in Sunset Park to engage residents on this question of the BQE. And a quote they put up on the screen stuck with me. It was a quote by Sadia Hartman, and it said, "So much of the work of oppression is policing the imagination." That's what's happening here, because Brooklyn has imagination. For decades, we've been coming up with new ideas for what to do with the BQE, whether it's the BQ Green, that was an idea started by then Councilwoman Diana Reyna. The imagination isn't the problem. The creativity isn't the problem. Yes, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be simple. There are real questions we'll have to answer. How to transition to marine and rail freight, how to boost our public transit so we can get folks out of cars, how to implement congestion pricing. But that doesn't scare me. I'm not worried about that. What concerns me, and what we should all be talking about, is that the state won't even let us get so far. By resisting to even come to the table for a conversation, they've cut us off at the knees, and they've muffled our right to imagine. The state has decided they're okay with the fact that working class communities will continue to be collateral damage of their inaction. They've decided they're fine with history repeating itself, with Brooklyn Heights getting a second pass at a better design, while the other areas are relegated to the same racist infrastructure of the past. And they've made this choice in a time where transportation policy is changing by the year, by the day. For us to commit to infrastructure that was built under Robert Moses' era makes no sense. We can do better. We can be smarter. But it doesn't seem like that's the path we're heading towards. So what I want to say to you all is that we have to face reality. And reality is not that we won't get a reimagined BQE. It's not that we won't be the leaders in urban renewal we know we can be. We're going to get there. Brooklyn is going to get there. The reality that we have to face is that we're not going to get there because of the state or even because of the city. We're going to get there because the will of the people grew too strong, too loud, and forceful for them to ignore. We're going to get there because our ideas are too good, too bold, too expansive for the state to say no any longer. And we're going to get there while doing what we do best, and that's spreading love, because it's the Brooklyn way. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We're sending love back to you guys. And I'd like to bring up Janet Fink, who's going to give us an overview of the day.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm Janet Fink. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Institute for Public Architecture. We have a really big day planned, so I think we need to pace ourselves a little bit. So the IPA, we're now in our 10th year of programming, and as Jonathan mentioned, we use design to address social and physical inequities in the city through our signature design fellowships and our residency programs, exhibits, publications, and our related public events like today's symposium. Our residency program offers designers and thinkers in the public realm an opportunity to live and work at the Block House here on Governor's Island. And our summer cohort is arriving in June, 6 amazing young designers and architects. And we're also going to be releasing a call for applications for the fall, so keep your eye out for that. Our signature design fellowships typically focus on a pressing urban issue facing communities within the 5 boroughs, and most recently we've been focusing on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Residents and community groups all along the BQE have been advocating for a transformation of the highway for years, if not decades. Back in 2020, following on the heels of Mayor de Blasio's expert panel report and former City Council Speaker Corey Johnson's call to consider tearing the BQE down, the IPA began exploring the BQE question with our fellowship, to be or not to be QE. We continued in 2020 with reconnecting communities across the BQE, where fellows worked with community groups on visions for neighborhoods along the corridor. Proposals from both fellowships, together with an animation by Segregation by Design and drone footage of the BQE by Inez Long, are on exhibit at the Blockhouse through tomorrow, and the Blockhouse is open today if you would like to stop by between 12 and 4. Am I advancing? Oh yeah. So we do have some amazing continuing education credits available, which if you are an architect or hoping to be an architect, you can apply for those credits. There's some forms to fill out outside. Okay. We all know the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway is crumbling, and federal funding is on the table for repairs. But what about radically reconsidering the entire divisive and polluting highway? How can we use this opportunity to mitigate climate change, redress historic environmental injustice, and significantly improve quality of life for all New Yorkers? These and other questions will be addressed in 4 panel discussions today. Our goal is to bring all voices to the table, including government agencies, elected officials, thank you very much for coming out, policymakers, transportation, housing, and climate experts, and residents of Brooklyn and Queens in order to raise awareness of the issues and opportunities facing communities along the BQE and propel this important conversation about the future of our wonderful city to the forefront. With BQE 2053, we ask, in 30 years, what kind of city do we want to be living in? And what collective action do we need to take in order to make this vision a reality? So I'd like to get started with our first panel. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce the moderator and the panelists all at once, and these introductions will be very brief. We have an amazing website built by Alec Ravensky that has all of the speaker bios and all amazing resources on it, so I refer you to that. After each of the presentations, they'll join the moderator on stage for a panel discussion, about 20 minutes, and a 10-minute audience Q&A. So Marc Norman is our moderator for the first panel. Mr. Biden, take down this highway. Marc is the Silverstein Chair in Real Estate Development and Investment, and he's the Associate Dean at the Schack Institute of Real Estate at NYU. He's an urban planner and a veteran in the field of community development and finance. A former Loeb Fellow, and we have many Loeb Fellows today. Marc has extensive experience with affordable housing development in conjunction with highway removal projects, most recently in Syracuse. And he'll be giving a presentation. Not all of the moderators today will be giving presentations. After Marc's presentation, our first speaker will be Adam Paul Susaneck. He's an architect and founder of Segregation by Design. Alex Levine, who is the Health Policy Fellow for Representative Ritchie Torres, and Nilka Martell, who's the founder of Loving the Bronx, are community activists working on capping the Cross Bronx Expressway, and they'll be speaking together. Dan Wiley, the District Director for North Brooklyn and Western Queens for Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez. And then the last speaker of this panel will be Marshall Foster, who's the Interim Director of the Seattle Center and former Director of the Office of Waterfront and Civic Projects in Seattle. So let's get started with Marc.
Thank you, Janet. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. And just a real shout out to the Institute for Public Architecture for hosting this and thinking about highways and what comes after them. So on this panel, you're going to hear histories of displacement, destruction, urban renewal, but also tales of triumph, reclaiming land, legacies, and agency over community development. So we're in an interesting moment. The earliest highways that rip through our communities are reaching the end of their useful life, and we're at a point where we have an opportunity to rethink what the jurisdictions are going to do, and hopefully communities are empowered to change the narrative from wounding to healing. So my earliest memory of highway destruction didn't directly affect me, but my parents sold their house to somebody displaced by Highway 105 in Los Angeles, and it was a late highway, so they came with a relocation check, and it actually opened with a light rail line down the middle, and it also had a housing corporation actually doing affordable housing around it, but it's still a scar and a barrier that ripped through intact minority communities. And so pollution, displacement, disconnection, the result of these highways that tore through almost every American city from the 50s through the 80s in previous infrastructure bills, we doubled down on that, denying induced demand, allowing the widening, and really thinking that was progress. So Biden's bill might, hopefully, be the first to acknowledge the harm and provide some alternatives. That said, a scar scabs over and heals to a certain degree, but it usually heals into a different condition. And it stays rough, and it stays noticeable, and it stays jarring. If we close our eyes, we can imagine the past, and like all sort of nostalgia, it's glorious and cohesive, and what was lost is overwhelming. But when we open our eyes and examine the historical record, things are a little bit different, not quite as rosy. Additionally, in the intervening time, new stories are written, different lives are lived, and also new nostalgias take shape. So as we enter this moment when we're able to right some of the wrongs of the past and reconnect what was disconnected and take the wounds and restitch them, it's necessary actually to think, well, to ask ourselves, what are we connecting? Who are the beneficiaries? What will be the result? What happens when we win the highway takedown battles, which you'll see today? What will be the new battles? Who are we fighting for? So we have examples from around the country on this panel. Capping, gridding, tunneling, boulevarding. It's happening in communities of color that were denied resources and had fabrics taken away decades ago. Many fell behind, lost neighborhood amenities, and in many cases, those that could leave left. So when we put things back, we're doing it in a 21st century context, a context of TIF districts and low-income housing tax credits and 4/2 podium buildings and the kind of amenities that have a CVS on the ground floor and a Bank of America branch, not the kind of nostalgic pictures that we see when we see what the context was before. And so our cities, especially in the Northeast, we have to acknowledge, are also different places with changing demographics. The highway construction heyday coincided also with a rise in minority populations in those neighborhoods. We're seeing a decline of those minority populations going, like many others in this country, to the south and to the west. So understanding sort of our demographic conditions and suburbanization, we also have to ask ourselves once again, who will reclaim the land? What will be the new condition and who will benefit? So, building housing, retail, playgrounds, community facilities won't change the persistent racial wealth gap, the appraisal gap, the homeownership gap. It won't necessarily affect the people that were displaced or stuck or uncompensated. And there's the potential that those people harmed the most won't be in the supply chains for the revitalization. So how do we build back, looking at finance, looking at development, looking at policy? How do we not only repair the scars and bridge the gaps, but also build wealth and agency as we reclaim this land? So what are the lessons we can glean from the initiatives across the country? Hopefully we'll hear those today. And how does it relate to the BQE, to the 12 miles, not to the cantilever as the borough president said, but to the entire 12 miles that it runs. So I feel honored to have so many great voices. And I'll invite the speakers up. I think we're going one at a time, but then we'll have a panel discussion afterwards. So thank you. And I think, are we starting with Adam?
Thank you, Marc. Great. So, hey everybody, my name is Adam Paul Susaneck. I am the founder of the project Segregation by Design, which uses historic photography to document the destruction of communities of color due to redlining, urban renewal, and highway construction. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for having me, and thank you, Janet, for organizing this, and thank you to everyone for being here. So what I'm going to do today, very briefly, is present the problems posed by freeways today, a brief history of how we got here, and what we can do. What we can do about it. So, that's my kid yelling in the background. Sorry about that. So I recently had the opportunity to write an article for the New York Times, which covers some of what I'm going to be discussing today. And these are some of the projects that the project intends to cover, these are some of the cities that the project intends to cover. These are the ones that I've done so far, and this is the complete list of cities. So this is a list of cities that got money from two bills in particular, the 1956 Federal Highway Act and then the 1949 Federal Housing Act. The 56 Highway Act is what funded the interstate system, and then the 49 Housing Act is what funded a lot of the urban renewal programs around the country. So, starting again, what I said is I'm going to present the problems posed by freeways, how we got here, and what we can do about it. So starting with the problems posed by freeways, so this is Houston. Problem number one is we haven't actually stopped expanding them in a lot of places. So Houston, seen here, is encircled by interstates, which divide the city pretty cleanly along racial lines. And rather than pursuing ways to lessen the divide, the city is actually spending $10 billion to widen the freeways, seen here. This is the right-of-way. Whoops. Back. Well, the red was the right-of-way, cutting through downtown. And this is a similar view, top-down, of the widening project, the right-of-way. And as part of this project, they're demolishing, so about 1,000 people are going to be displaced, primarily in the primarily Hispanic neighborhoods of the near north side and then east downtown. The project has already, they've actually already started construction on this project. They've already started demolishing the Clayton Public Homes, which was a public housing facility built before that highway, actually, which is interesting. That housed primarily Black and Latino residents. Since the mid-20th century, projects like this, urban highway construction, has worked as a powerful tool to segregate American cities and demolish communities of color. These roadways built on the legacy of redlining, creating literal walls of concrete and smog that sort of took the red lines off the map and built them in the real world. And again, while the period of government-led segregation is often described as history, projects like this one in Texas show that it's really anything but. And then this is a map of the Bronx with noise pollution and asthma rates. I'm supposed to have that on one slide, that's my bad. But so for the communities that remain divided by these highways, considerable public health impacts persist. In the South Bronx, seen here, the ring of highways that surrounds the neighborhood partially accounts for the incredibly high rates of asthma in the area, with nearly every single census tract in the South Bronx being in the 99th percentile for asthma. And Alex and Nilka will touch upon this more. So going now back a bit into history, this is also the Bronx. The Cross Bronx and the BQE, but the Cross Bronx was really one of the earliest to be built in the city. And what was interesting, Robert Caro discusses this in The Power Broker, what was interesting about the Cross Bronx versus previous, the Autobahn, previous limited access highways that had been built, those were built primarily through open country, whereas the Cross Bronx was really the first one to be built through an existing city. The only sort of parallel would be Haussmann in Paris. So the Cross Bronx was directly responsible for the displacement of over 40,000 people in the borough. And the route of the highways, the Cross Bronx is in particular, I keep pressing the wrong one. The Cross Bronx in particular is this one which cuts through the top here. But this ring of highways, again, which is really responsible for a lot of that asthma. And then I've also highlighted in orange the federally funded urban renewal projects, federal and state funded, that I'll touch on later. So, unfortunately, the Cross Bronx served as a model for other cities looking to develop their own highway networks. After President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, that bill that I mentioned earlier. This bill provided a 90% federal match for freeway construction which represents one of the largest single investments from the federal government in urban infrastructure. And the way that the construction of these highways really played out on the ground was the destruction of vibrant urban neighborhoods. This is the Bronx again, where the freeway cuts through Cortana Park there. And Brooklyn is a similar story. And actually, as Janet mentioned, if you go to the Blockhouse during or after the presentation, there's an animation showing the construction of the BQE cutting through Brooklyn, getting really zoomed in. It's pretty cool. I made it, but I can say that. I have animations like that of other cities too, but the BQE is really, and the Cross Bronx is really quite something because of the density that it cut through. But construction of the BQE required the forcible displacement of tens of thousands of people across the two boroughs. Designed by Robert Moses, the highway cut a nearly 15-mile gash through some of the most densely populated neighborhoods on the planet, ripping the core out of several communities, isolating others, and inundating others with traffic. So this is a bit of a zoom in. And again, you can see the animation which shows this a little better, but these are some of the central neighborhoods. You can see the BQE cutting down through cutting down through Williamsburg, down through Williamsburg into downtown Brooklyn, through Red Hook, dividing Red Hook, down into Sunset Park. And then in addition, showing the other Robert Moses projects here, the widening of Atlantic Avenue, Pratt Institute. I pressed the wrong button again, but I'm going to keep moving. So these projects, again, built on the legacy of redlining, which was a federal practice beginning in the 1930s, in which the federal government basically went city by city, rating each neighborhood for investment worthiness, primarily based on the metrics of race. And they did this through the mechanism of liquidity to the banks. The actual mechanism is complicated. And I know many of you are familiar with redlining, but redlining exacerbated the declining conditions in these neighborhoods by creating an artificial disinvestment. And many of the neighborhoods that the highway cut through were formerly redlined neighborhoods. Seen here is Red Hook. Red Hook, home to the Red Hook Houses, which is the largest public housing project in Brooklyn. The housing project was completely cut off from the rest of the city by the approach to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which formed a massive traffic-choked, exhaust-spewing trench or elevated structure between Red Hook and the rest of the city. In this case, the commercial avenue of Hamilton Ave, seen here, was completely gobbled up by the construction of the approach to the tunnel. And again, it exacerbated existing racial segregation in the area, completely cutting off Red Hook from the rest of the neighborhood, and creating a literal wall between Red Hook and the rest of the neighborhood. So continuing to downtown, this is another image of Red Hook. This is Hamilton Avenue. That's the BMT 33 trolley line, which was also destroyed in the construction. So continuing to downtown Brooklyn, the construction of the BQE flattened much of the historic core of what had been formerly known as New York's Twin City before the days of municipal consolidation. Time's up. Okay, sorry guys. So the highways so I'll try to wrap this up. So the construction of highways and the forces unleashed by redlining exacerbated existing urban decay within cities, which many cities used as an excuse to remake their civic cores for the convenience of suburban white commuters, and they did that using the mechanism of the 1949 Housing Act, which provided a two-thirds federal match for urban renewal and slum clearance projects. So seen here is Boston, the diverse West End, which was redlined and heavily damaged by the construction of the Central Artery, was completely leveled for the expansion of Mass General, but it was actually mostly parking and in addition to a courthouse and some institutional buildings. And non-white neighborhoods were targeted with such intensity that in nearly every single city across the country, it was disproportionately, again, non-white neighborhoods that were affected. So for instance, what this chart is showing, I made this with the New York Times, what this chart is showing is that Philadelphia in the 50s, about 20% of the Philadelphia population was non-white, but about 70% of those displaced were people of color. Sorry, I'm going to wrap up. This is, what we can do about it is what other folks will discuss later, but this is a project I worked on in the Bronx with my company ACOM. Yes, thank you. Sorry guys, I'm taking too much of your time. But basically, downgrading this from a highway, the Sheridan, downgrading it to a boulevard, boulevardization, making it more pedestrian friendly, reactivating Starlight Park, providing access across the river. This is a model that we can follow to help solve the problem. Sorry I took so much time. Thank you.
Getting the timer going, 8 minutes. Nilka, you want to come on? So thanks so much for having us. Thank you to Janet for, perfect.
Thank you.
Hello? Okay. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you to Janet and everyone for organizing. My name is Alex Levine. I am finishing medical school in the Bronx and also work on health and environmental policy for Rep. Ritchie Torres.
And how are you all? I am so excited to be here with you. My name is Nilka Martell. I'm the founder and director of a grassroots organization in the Bronx called Loving the Bronx. And pass it back over to Alex.
And I'm like the opening act to Nilka's main event. So I guess, can I go back? Okay, so the focus today is around public health and coalition building and efforts to transform the Cross Bronx Expressway. Earlier, someone said that the most important capital project in New York City is the BQE. We would argue otherwise. And you guys are worried about 30 miles. We're worried about 6 miles. So in terms of, budgeting, whatever, this is maybe an easier project, maybe. But so my involvement in this started looking for a project that was focused on health, transportation, and infrastructure, and that had really strong community support. And there's the first time I heard about Nilka's work was through there's like an online news platform in the Bronx called Welcome to the Bronx that wrote a story about this paper by Dr. Peter Munig, who can't be here today, and sort of about this community organizer that was focused on the same issue. And that issue was health implications and sort of quality of life implications of the Cross Bronx Expressway. And in 2018, a professor of public health at Columbia modeled this study of what capping the below grade portion, so 2.5 miles that are below grade of the Cross Bronx Expressway, if you built deck parks on top of that, what that would do for health and quality of life. And in his model, it sort of looked at as a cost-efficient public health intervention that would decrease emergency department visits related to asthma and the general burden of chronic disease in the Bronx with sort of the common suspects of diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease that plagues communities both in Brooklyn but also throughout New York City and throughout the United States, really. And so together I thought those were really strong connections, and my medical school is also the health system that is the largest employer in the Bronx. And healthcare is the largest industry in the Bronx, but specifically the health system that I train in is the largest employer. And so I wanted to elevate this project within our health system to really, because most of the issues around health in the Bronx exist outside the hospital. So just to sort of drive that forward, if you look at New York City health data and you look at the overlap of the darkest red is percent non-white. So if you look at the overlap of non-white neighborhoods, and then here is poverty, the darkest red is concentrated in that same triangulated area where you have the Cross Bronx Expressway, the Major Deegan, and the Bruckner that you could see in Adam's map of noise pollution. And again, if you look at annual rates of asthma with children and adults, and asthma-related emergency department visits. It's all in that same area and really follows the racial and sort of economic demographics of New York City. And now I turn it over to Nilka.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. So a lot of these projects, the timeline usually starts when money is allocated, right? And that's just not the story. Our efforts at Loving the Bronx stem back to 2012 when we started a block beautification project, which was really successful, and we branched out to the local park, Virginia Park and Hugh Grant Circle, which we started stewarding and programming in 2012. We were successful in getting a $10.3 million reconstruction grant for both of those parks through a Parks Without Borders initiative. This was in 2016. When we went back to the park, we realized, well, the park's going to be closed for renovation. You know, what are we going to do next? And Virginia Park was situated next to a below-grade portion of the Cross Bronx Expressway. We had been part of the efforts for the Sheridan Expressway, remodifying the Sheridan Expressway into what it currently is, the Sheridan Boulevard. And during those classes, we were taught this concept of capping or decking, which wasn't something that can be used specifically at the Sheridan because the Sheridan was at grade. But we took this information back to our local park and started thinking, hey, you know, we're just a group of neighbors. If we were successful on a block beautification project, we were successful in getting this funding for a reconstruction grant, let's dream larger, right? So in 2016, we kicked off this campaign called Cap the Cross Bronx, and it was a really small project, really just looking at this small portion. Can you hit the next slide? Next to Virginia Park. Currently, we were able to team up with different stakeholders in the community. It wasn't until 2011 when we met Alex Levine that we were able to really advance this project. So Ritchie, Torres, and Senator Chuck Schumer allocated $2 million for a feasibility study. It is currently being studied right now. There were 5 public sessions hosted in April and May, and another 5 coming in June and July. Next slide. This is where I live. This is the Parkchester area of the Bronx. That is where the genesis of these ideas. But with Dr. Munich's report, we realized there are 2.2 miles of the highway that's below grade. So right now, New York State DOT, New York City DOT, New York City Planning, and Department of Health are conducting the feasibility study under Reimagine the Cross Bronx, right? So while we were looking at the 2.2 miles, they're looking at the 6.5 miles. You know, so working together with these agencies and different community stakeholders, right? But looking at the bigger picture, right? What does this look like if it's capped? Can some of these portions be you know, under parks jurisdiction on the state level? Can some of it be in a community land trust? Can there be permanent affordable housing, right? When we talk about the magnitude of these projects, property values change, and we really don't want to displace people that have been harmed throughout the years, you know, with the fumes that are created with the Cross Bronx. I think that's all the time that I have, but we'll be here for the rest of the afternoon, and we thank you all.
All right, great. Well, I want to thank Jonathan and Janet and everybody for working so hard on bringing us together. Dan Wiley, I'm a district director for Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez. And when I was talking with Jonathan and Janet, I was saying, well, you know, we looked at this stuff, you know, like 15, 20 years ago, and what we could do with the highway. And in talking with Marc, he was saying he was working on the situation in Syracuse and reevaluating what to do. And I figured I have to mention that I was born in Syracuse, and my father was an organic chemistry professor. And what these are actually glass slides that organic chemists use to show chemical reactions. He transitioned from doing that to protesting urban renewal in Syracuse, where a highway was plowing through, got very active with the Congress of Racial Equality. And then this is showing, for example, as we know from urban renewal projects and these highway projects, here he was illustrating how where the ghetto was being displaced and people were being removed and relocated in urban renewal projects to enable the highway to plow through the middle of Syracuse. So I was an infant. I was born in 1962 at Syracuse, and I did spend some time in jail with my mother as we were arrested protesting this urban renewal site. So that's my background. Fast forward 2000, I started to work for Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, and this is a map showing her district that's morphed over the decades. This is showing parts of her district and the serpent that cuts through the district called the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway runs through it. It includes the Gowanus Expressway. And in particular in Sunset Park, you have a little timeline of the construction of the Gowanus Expressway. But in 1998, Congresswoman Velázquez got high priority money in the T21 highway reauthorization bill. So there's cycles of reauthorizing highway funding. And so she secured money for a tunnel study to look at taking the portion of the highway, the Gowanus, and what if that 3rd Avenue corridor, it disappeared? And then the gash that went through the neighborhood was opened up for new opportunities. So there's a lot of meetings, and I see Joanne Simon. Assemblywoman Joanne Simon is here. She was part of the Gowanus Community Stakeholder Group with Assemblywoman Joan Millman, and also Uprose and a lot of grassroots organizations, and also we'll have on a panel from Brooklyn Heights, Cindy. Brooklyn Heights Association leagued up with Uprose and other organizations along this corridor to advocate for looking at a tunnel alternative if you're going to rebuild the viaduct. So this just shows, some stationary, town hall meetings that we've had. It took 12 community groups to sue state DOT to get them to spend the $18 million the Congresswoman had earmarked, if you will, to look at a tunnel alternative and do an EIS. This is showing the different alignments. We hadn't realized how broadly the highway could move if you were to consider a tunnel, and actually if you were to put in a tunnel, you might want to do more of a harbor alignment, and this shows the dotted line of community harbor alignment. Also, problems with studies is when you look at a segment, it tends to be restrictive, and it may not make sense to do a tunnel if you're only considering it ending right here at Hamilton Avenue on this side of the Gowanus Canal instead of coming up under and joining the trench. This is some correspondence. When communities come together and want to see something change, they have to get technical advice. And we all know that, working with architects and planners and engineers. And this is some correspondence showing the reluctance of state DOT to actually fund a community technical advisor. And you can talk with Joanne Simon more about the trials and tribulations of that. Fast forward, the DOT decided that they were going to terminate the EIS and just work on keeping the highway in good repair. So after millions of dollars and a whole EIS, we went through, Joanne, I don't know how many years of meetings and EIS. It was just terminated and comes to no record of decision at the end of the study, and effectively spends $1 billion on redecking. But there's still issues of how the thing is going to be held up in the future, just like the triple cantilever. Also, what about those spaces between Brooklyn Heights and the Gowanus Expressway? And then here, also the Congresswoman in 2006 got money. This is earmark money to study burying or decking over the trench in Cobble Hill. And this is showing some of the the meetings and then study that came out, looking at what could you do. Everything from more connections across to actually decking it over, or short of decking it over, doing some kind of canopy, and then various costs associated with doing the different kinds of interventions. D-Land Studio and Susanna Drake, have to give her a big shout out. She couldn't be here today, but she should be, no fault of hers. But she did share some slides. And then she was working on this project as well. The earlier slides I showed you was Star White House. She, of course, also has worked on a lot of other projects. Fast forward 2005, the Congresswoman, instead of getting money for looking at the highway per se, got first real substantial money for the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, which runs the 15 miles parallel to the BQE. So instead of just dealing with the BQE, what can we do with my 1 minute left to have an alternative waterfront access and green ribbon that connects people? And this shows actually what went into the state decision to rescind their EIS for the triple cantilever, because the triple cantilever also had an EIS that state DOT did. And here's their announcement saying, we're not going to do that. We don't have enough money. We're not going to continue with the EIS, but we're going to build the Kosciuszko Bridge. So that's where they put the money. This is showing the two decking projects, this one Cobble Hill, this one BQ Green, which you're going to hear more about, of course. And this is Susanna Drake's work. And I have my own timer too. And this is showing you, you'll see more of this. I know Diana Rain is here, so you'll get more on BQ Green. But more similar environmental justice issues up and down the corridor. We can't just solve the central triple cantilever, of course. And what could the future bring? This is the Congresswoman's quote. And thank you very much. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right, big green button. All right, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you, and thank you to Jonathan, Janet, for the excuse and opportunity to be back in New York. It's been a while, and Clare for hosting us here at Governor's Island. We actually have a strong personal connection. We learned a lot from the Governor's Island team in the early phases of this work on our waterfront, so it's just a pleasure to be back. I always love being surrounded by water as a Seattleite, too. It just feels very natural. I'm going to talk to you about a project that, when I look out at what you all are facing in this conversation, it reminds me of where we were in Seattle about 12 years ago. And for those of you who are looking at the prospect of everything here and thinking about it may be daunting, I can tell you we started in a very similar place, and we've had a real journey. And I'm going to talk to you about successes as well as compromises and failures. One of the nice things about coming to talk out of town is I can be a little more blunt about some of the dynamics. For those of you who don't know Seattle, I like to ground us in the Salish Sea. So if you understand, much about where we are, one of the key things that a lot of people don't know is that we really are part of an environmental system that connects this kind of northwest corner of the United States with Canada. And the Salish Sea is the geography that really defines the geography of where we live. And Seattle is an isthmus that's really defined by the water bodies that it was essentially settled to harvest the natural resources from that region. And in the process, we displaced a really, really important native community. The Duwamish tribe, the Muckleshoot tribe, the Suquamish. A big part of what we're doing with our waterfront is trying to create space for those partners to come back into our waterfront and to be part of the city again, 160 years later. This is an image of early days on our waterfront. It's called Alaskan Way. You'll hear me talk about that a lot. That's a reference to the Yukon Pacific and all the days of the gold rush in Alaska. This is what it looked like when Seattle settled. Compared to some of the conversations you're having here, our waterfront was not didn't have a huge residential component. It was really a industrial, commercial harbor. One of the things that I think is really interesting about it is you see that water in the foreground. We literally built our city out to the deep water. We extended our city out on trestles to connect to that natural deep water port. And literally, the economy of Seattle was built on exporting timber and coal, which a lot of people don't know. Most of the wood that rebuilt San Francisco after the Great Fire came from Puget Sound. So that's really where how our city was formed. Like most American cities, we made a tragic mistake around World War II, which is that we embraced the freeway system. This is the construction of the Alaskan Way Viaduct. And this project has been all about the removal of that viaduct to create about 20 acres of public parks and open space in its place. So we'll talk more about that. A couple references to Robert Moses. So Robert Moses in his later career consulted in taking his experiences in New York to other American cities and actually had a pretty big hand in not this particular freeway, but the subsequent connection, which was to be built, but was never built, between Alaskan Way and our other major freeway scar through Seattle, which is I-5. In the 60s, we had a freeway revolt, which a couple other West Coast cities did as well, where the community realized the size of mistake we were making with these freeways, and they stopped the expansion of the system, which we were very fortunate, like San Francisco, to have that moment. And we have, if you read our local paper, editorials going back to the 60s saying this was one of the biggest mistakes we've ever made as a city. That's what the viaduct looked like until about 2019. And as you can see, Seattle is a gorgeous city, lucky to be on Elliott Bay. We literally walled our city off from its waterfront. The key thing that happened, I'm going to give you this history very quickly, is that in 2004, we had an earthquake, the Nisqually earthquake. It damaged our downtown seawall, which that viaduct structure rests on. Set off a huge public debate between the State Transportation Department, the City of Seattle, and a few other kind of key leadership roles in terms of how best to replace it. We had the benefit of a crisis, which forced us to rethink this corridor. And to make a very long story short, 3 ballot measures and about 6 years of public debate later, we chose to replace that viaduct with a deep bore tunnel and put the state highway underground. There were a lot of other ideas. The city, including myself, were deeply invested in not replacing the highway and building a surface transit approach to that. The governor at the time wanted to rebuild the viaduct as an elevated structure, so we compromised to get this thing down and to reclaim that waterfront. This is the program that we built. I'm not going to go through all of it, but basically everything in yellow, the city never gave up the right-of-way, which is a really important thing. When we built that highway in the first place, the city retained the right-of-way. So once we decided on the tunnel, we had the right to design that space to our standards, which a lot of cities don't have the benefit of. Whole host of other mega projects that are part of this. It's about a $4.5 billion system overall. Once the decision was made in 2009 to do the tunnel, it set off a critical phase of planning for the removal of the viaduct in the new park, which you can see a little bit. This was all led by the city, and we had a major partnership with the state that kind of allowed them to step aside and focus on their new tunnel, and we focused on the surface streets. Major public process, engaging our tribal partners, all of our adjacent communities in what that vision for the space would be. And this is what the state did. If there's one kind of big lesson I think I learned from this, it was important at the end of the day to give the state DOT that big project that they could go do, because that's what they love to do. And so they got to go build a $4 billion tunnel. It is a work of art. If you love big civil engineering projects, it is amazing. It's the largest diameter tunnel in the world for vehicles. So you can see there the scale of it. They did a lot of good urban design to try to fit into the city fabric. But most importantly is we got to bring down that viaduct structure. And this day literally, still gives me goosebumps thinking about what it was like. This is Pioneer Square, which is our oldest historic neighborhood, with that viaduct coming down. And set the stage for us to essentially create a new 20-acre park. A key thing here is our downtown waterfront is a huge part of our natural migration system for juvenile salmon. And when you think about Seattle, you probably think about salmon. So that environmental restoration was actually the beating heart of our new waterfront design. And that's where our tribal partnership became so essential. I'm not going to say a lot more, but to show you some pictures, this is what it looks like today. That habitat system is actually below you, the folks walking along the new promenade. These are some of the tours we do to show people how the salmon system works. These are some of the incredible community events that are taking place. The first phases of the park are now built, so people are out there enjoying it. And we are about 2 years from completion of construction. And so this is the last slide I'm going to show you, which is one of the major park features, which is literally connecting across from Pike Place Market down to our new waterfront. So anyway, that's a quick tour of what's happening in Seattle, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
I don't know if this is on, but so I'm actually convinced, like all of your presentations convinced me that we need to cap, tear down, reconnect communities. My question is, I think every presentation mentioned how horrible DOTs are, and I agree with that too. And I'm wondering, how do we convince what seem to be every Department of Transportation seems to be awful and behind the times. How do we convince them, right? Because you made a health argument, right? You made a historic argument. You made an argument, right, about the ways that communities need to be changed, and you actually showed that it's possible. So how do we convince the DOTs outside of an earthquake?
We need an earthquake.
We just had one, 2.2.
That's what did it in Oakland.
I think for us, our Congressmember Ritchie Torres puts a lot of pressure on state DOT. He's written a couple letters to them specifically with regards to the community sessions that have been hosted. When you walked into the room, there was nothing about capping. Nothing, there was no option to study capping. The DOT took this approach of, oh, if the community comes in and says they want it capped, because the average New Yorker is gonna walk in there and be like, hey, cap the highway, right? It's just, and what gets us frustrated is the fact that this money was allocated because we worked with our elected officials specifically to study the option of capping. So I would say two things. Pack the house with community, because DOT gets scared, right? They're like, oh my God, 200 people are here. And keep that relationship with your elected officials so that they can work for you and put that pressure on DOT, and both on the city and the state level, not just state DOT.
And I think to add to that, I think there's a big question of ownership. Like, I think community members who have worked on this for a long time really take ownership of the project and believe in the project. And I think elected officials answering to those community members can also find ways to take ownership and realize like they have a vested interest in seeing this project be successful. But from our conversations and meetings with city DOT and state DOT, I think for them to take ownership of the project, given that it's amongst many projects that they're managing, like, you know, the people working on the Cross Bronx are also working on the BQE. And so I don't know at this point that I've been convinced that we've met someone who like truly believes that this is really gonna happen, that is working in city or state DOT. I think they are like committed to the project in a project management sort of perspective where like whatever the next deliverable is, like they're gonna get there. But I do think I don't know if that means where you have people who have really finding ways to hire community members to do the outreach, but I think finding ways to get those city agencies and state agencies to take ownership is part of the answer.
And I would add, and of course we have to consult with Marshall, of course, and everyone in this room. I mean, it takes a village to not raise a highway, because even with a village, you may not
be successful, as we have seen. And if you do a lot of studies, you can get a lot of hopes up. And in the end of the day, it comes down to budgets, and it comes down to, how you represent the cost-benefit analysis. The village in this case is the community groups. So glad that groups like Brooklyn Heights Association, Uprose, El Puente, the list goes on. That is the fuel that gives elected officials more ammo to try to move the dial. And of course, with elected officials, I have to acknowledge that Congresswoman Velasquez no longer represents the section I was talking about in Southwest Brooklyn. That's now Dan Goldman. Dan Goldman is, we're working with him because we pick it up by Whitman, Ingersoll houses, Farragut houses, and our district continues up through where BQ Green is proposed. And also, of course, Assemblywoman Joanne Simon, State Senator Andrew Gennardis, as well as our Councilman Lincoln Restler and other council people up and down the corridor, Jennifer Gutierrez. So we do meetings every week, we're doing meetings, strategy meetings on how we move the dial. And every month, we meet with City Hall. And now we scaled back to every 2 weeks, right, Joanne? But every 2 weeks, we're meeting and strategizing. And we're demanding more workshops and more engagement. And I have to say that it's not as bad as it was a month ago, because we are seeing a little movement from state DOT. So I don't want to give the impression that state DOT is doing nothing. They're actually, their hand is being forced, and they're actually agreeing. And of course, the pressure has to be at the executive level, local elected officials, to the governor and the mayor. And that's, of course, the bottom line. But
one just other quick thought. When we did the waterfront and the decisions were being made, frankly, the environmental determinants of health, that whole idea that I was so happy to hear you all are talking about, really wasn't on the scene. This was back in the aughts. What's happening now, there's several new projects around freeway removals and capping in Seattle, which I could also, probably should have brought some slides on those, but that is a huge driver of the conversation. And what our community and city are doing is folding that into the environmental analysis. So the state DOT is having to accept that is part of how their project gets measured, which to me is like, as a planner and knowing how important SEPA is, CEQA, as you all call it. CEQA, sorry. That is a big hook. And I would keep working that to get that sort of part of what drives their decision making.
So there is, and I noticed in your slides, it's a lot of parkland and open space, but there is this question of financialization that we deal with. And a lot of the capping and takedown projects are how much land do we create, and what value does that create for housing, retail, and other things. And you can start making a kind of financial argument, and I'm wondering how you make the argument for more open space and how we make it as we think about the Cross Bronx or the BQE.
Yeah, so we made a commitment very early on that the whole right-of-way would remain public.
Who's we?
Sorry, the city of Seattle and the state, the decision makers. That was really important to the community because there was so much fear at the time that this would become the condoization of Seattle's waterfront. What we did in terms of funding it was we actually said, and this is something actually we looked at the High Line to learn from, was, okay, we're going to build 20 acres of parks. What's the real estate value that that's going to create? How do we capture a portion of that real estate value? And we created an assessment district for the entire downtown, which is generating about $160 million of the project cost. And then we had a big part of getting the state to go build their tunnel and step away was they had responsibility to replace the sort of arterial functions on the waterfront. And so they actually wrote the city a check for about $290 million to build all the transportation infrastructure because we held the right of way. That was super important. And then the city threw in another about $300 million from different sources. So we ended up with kind of this public-private partnership to put all those pieces together. But honestly, part of it, Seattle's very lucky. We're a very
wealthy city right now. We have a lot of money in the downtown, a lot of new development over the last 10 years that we were able to harness to help to finance this.
Yeah. Because I'm just thinking about, I mean, it's a great example, but it's an earthquake, and it's also downtown, and it's also on the waterfront. And when we think about, you know, Adam, to your point, talking about the segregation by design, the redlining, the urban renewal, you know, these communities have been disadvantaged, and when we want to bring them back, I don't know that we'll have the 300 million or so, you know, as a check from Amazon or whoever wrote it. But you know, what are some of the ways that we might, you know, take those costs and you know, make the argument that these communities actually, you know, need not only the capping, but also the money that comes with the operations and the long-term maintenance of the new infrastructure?
You know, I think that's a conversation, you know, so far as capping the Cross Bronx, that we're just starting to have, right? What is this going to look like? What's the economic benefit to the existing community, right? We realize, you know, we've been talking about this to community members since 2016, and the first thing that they say is, am I going to be displaced, right? The Bronx in particular is the last borough to be gentrified, you know, and that usually starts with the waterfront. I know that Adam, you know, shared about the changes that came to the Sheridan Expressway, and, you know, full transparency, I'm also the board chair for the Bronx River Alliance. So, you know, we just completed that park at Starlight Park, but now there's development coming in, right? Another 990 units of housing that is not affordable to the community that lives there, right? So these are the issues that are real, and, you know, conversations that have to be had, right? And can there be a way that, you know, a corridor is carved out, you know, and people are grandfathered in, you know, if you've lived there and you've been harmed by these fumes, you know, your rent won't, you know, you won't be displaced because of a rent hike, you know, so I don't know what the answer is, but I know that up in the Bronx, you know, particularly with the community, these are the conversations that the community is having. Like, what benefit is it for us if there are capped portions? Can there be permanent affordable housing? Could there be modular units put in that can be incubators for startup businesses, right? Like, we have to really think out of the box when it comes to these spaces, and really have the community engaged in coming up with ideas as to what it is, right? The existing community, not the community that's going to come, but really the people that have been harmed, you know, and it's not such a big corridor as the BQE, it's 6 miles, but 6 miles, you know, that historically, since the Cross Bronx has been there, is, you know, a poor area, right? So we really want to be mindful, you know, that these projects do have consequences, and there are pros and cons, and yes, in the Bronx, we do deserve, you know, cleaner air, but not at the cost of people being displaced.
If I could just dovetail with that, I know Hank Gutman's going to be a lunch speaker, who's on the board of Brooklyn Bridge Park. Brooklyn Bridge Park is an example of, you know, a big project that needed money for maintenance and operation. There was a housing associated with the development of the park that was a bit controversial. I know under his leadership and de Blasio, they also included affordable housing, but that was some of the housing development that took up like 15% of the land or something of the park, did include affordable housing, but also generated revenue for the maintenance and operation of Brooklyn Bridge Park. I mention that because the conversation around getting the state or any entity to build something, where's the revenue going to come from, opens a Pandora's box about, well, what happens with the development opportunities if you do get this thing into a tunnel. It's great that Seattle is able to keep it all park. Would that be the case? And in the case of the Gowanus Expressway, Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation, it is industrial zone, and kind of there's an interstitial mixed use area near 3rd Avenue, did a design competition for what would you do with the space if the viaduct came down. And, you know, there was, the Congresswoman participated, there's many community folks on the jury that actually picked a winning proposal that kind of had a combination of things. But I think that conversation about, what do you do with the development opportunities that's equitable but still generates revenue so that eggheads can see that their bottom line is not going to be totally screwed up.
That's tough. I want to also be able to take questions from the audience. And so if people do have questions, please let me know, and there are mics around. And while you think about that, or do we have a question in the middle?
Just add on one thing to the
yes. While you
so this question is very important because it's tough because most of our best examples of existing caps are in fairly wealthy areas. It's the Big Dig, it's the Madrid Rio, it's in Seoul, the Cheonggyecheon daylighting project, in Seattle along the waterfront. So it's really tough because how do you prevent displacement? I was recently writing about pedestrian deaths, and in areas where you make these basic fixes, then you attract development, and we haven't really figured out how to stop that. I just want to, one potentially good example is Oakland. Not a great one because it was also an earthquake, but they rerouted the freeway around West Oakland. It did indeed build a good amount of affordable housing on the site. Not enough, but yeah, it's tough. There's not great examples.
Quick question for Marshall. I'm a teacher. I think you can hear me unless you want. All right. Quick question for Marshall. You mentioned, just as an aside, that you actually favored a different version, which would have been more of a boulevard plan, maybe more like the Sheridan, as opposed to the tunneling. What did you see as the liabilities of the state basically paying for a tunnel while you reclaimed the waterfront?
Yeah, well, it was what Marc said at the beginning about induced demand. I mean, the city overall has a really, I think, progressive and correct policy about strategically reducing capacity, especially from the freeway system coming into the core of Seattle, so that we can reclaim and we can, frankly, support the kind of urban life we want in the core. And replacing the freeway infrastructure just ran against that. So we had developed a whole, what was called the Surface Transit Plan, which was to use the state money for that project instead on transit and pedestrian projects. It ultimately, was probably the right planning idea, but it did not have the right political calculus behind it. And it sounds probably pretty glib, but honestly, at the end of the day, we had to give our state DOT a big project to do. And as soon as that path became clear and we were able to free up the waterfront, the politics all lined up. I mean, they literally went out and raised $4 billion to build that project. And I don't mean to diminish it. I mean, the tunnel is very functional. It serves, we have huge industrial uses still in Seattle. Seattle still has a huge manufacturing core, and they need that functionality. We were going to try to put all that on the surface street. That was the dark side of our surface transit plan, is we were going to have a lot of surface freight that would have to use that corridor. So there are pluses with the tunnel too, but yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'm a tunnel fan. One of the things we learned in the BQE, which we started talking about a bored tunnel in 1993, which was before anybody in the United States had started. So, of course, they thought we were crazy, and we were. It was really all the community groups in the area. But it was very clear that the DOT was the biggest barrier there. But one of the challenges we have now is because we didn't do the Gowanus Tunnel, that roadway is now, the surface is in good shape, but it's being held up by, a lot of rotting stuff. And then we have the triple cantilever, which, as you know, is extremely precarious. And so the question really is time. There's another idea about a tunnel that would cut across Brooklyn, which actually I kind of like the idea, but I don't know how you do it in time, right? So even if you could convince the state to do it. So I'm really curious about how do we juggle this issue of time pressure with something like the triple cantilever, which is very precarious. How do we address that issue to have enough time to think through some of these other issues so that we can do something fundamentally different? If anybody has any clever ideas, we all want to know. Thank you.
And just to out her, that's Assemblywoman Joan Simon.
Who started doing this a long time ago.
Started doing it when she was a district leader. Wow. Before.
mean, I just have one example from Syracuse, actually, which is it reached the end of its useful life, and it was basically declared that something had to be done. And there were a couple of months where it was where you couldn't use the viaduct. And surprise, surprise, everything was okay. Like, traffic rerouted itself. It didn't get worse. People found new routes. And so I don't know if this is a possibility, but to think about small experiments where we say, well, what would happen if we took cars off for a while? If we rerouted trucks? If we, took a weekend or took one day to see what happens? Because I think there's always a doomsday scenario, which is like, where's the traffic going to go? And when we saw, right, in San Francisco, when the Embarcadero came down, or in Oakland, when the earthquake took down the freeway, traffic actually finds new routes. And it's not a permanent solution, but it might be one of the things we think about as we think about this. What are we going to do without the cantilever? I don't know. But if we don't do anything, it's going to close and traffic will go somewhere, and then we'll know. And so I think there are experiments we can do before it falls to think about what might happen there. Janet, do we have time for one? No. One quick question? Not. Okay.
One for Danny.
Okay, last question.
I was intrigued by the idea of a green canopy rather than conventional capping or decking. Can you give us a better idea of what it would be and what it would cost relative to capping or decking?
We could talk afterward, and I can give you the study. Star White House did that trellis proposal. I did want to mention also road diets. There's the McGinnis Boulevard that's built like a highway that was going to be isn't a highway, but now DOT is embarking on a road diet to make only one travel lane, a protected bike lane, and parking and loading. And it's not going to be the end of the world, because traffic will, like Marc was saying, will figure its way around. And actually, you don't have to take this shortcut through Greenpoint neighborhood to get from the BQE to the tunnel to Manhattan, or the bridges to Manhattan, or the LIE. You can just stay on that thing. Road diet we're looking at for the BQE corridor that we're really pushing, two lanes instead of 3 lanes. What happens to the freight and the trucks? And I think one thing we didn't talk about, and hopefully more panels will look at it, is how freight moves. And we have rail freight. And a shout out to Jerry Nadler, who has his Cross Harbor Freight Tunnel study, which is another tunnel which would cost a lot of money. But short of that, you have rail and port infrastructure that can be developed. And you have an agency called MARAD, right, which actually can fund and is funding upgrading 6 landings for intermodal movement of goods. So I think we just have to figure out how we move stuff.
Well, thank you to the panel, Adam, Alex, Nilka, Dan, Marshall, and Institute for Public Architecture. Thanks.